All right, let's go on to the next event that I've chosen, which is it's time to ship an organ to a hospital. So I'm going to draw the circle representing the process. I'm going to ask the very first question, which is, how do we know that it's time to ship an organ to a hospital? Well, we know because we have an organ that's been reserved. So I'm going to label this as the net flow of the data here. Rather than doing a query and response, in this case, I'm going to use the net flow of the data. I'm going to find the reserved organ. And you'll remember we have a data attribute here. We had that earlier, which was date and time reserved. Remember that? I'm going to put it here again just as a reminder. Date and time reserved. We have that data attribute so we can find if it's reserved or not. But we have to find that it's been reserved against a specific organ request. And I'm going to put that here. Okay. So find the organ that's been reserved against an organ request. And ship that organ to the hospital. Right? Well, let's do that, okay, and then see if there are any questions here. So one of the important things about doing these diagrams is don't spend a lot of time trying to figure out everything that's in the diagram because you can overthink it. Don't try to think about logic because logic is not part of this. It's just the flow of the data. It sort of has to make sense, of course, but don't get caught up in it. I've seen some people sort of draw the bubble, stand back, and stare at it for 20 minutes, trying to figure it all out in their heads. But don't do that. Do one data flow at a time. So here we're going to send the organ to the hospital. And sometimes you'll see the way that I work is that I work backwards sometimes. I work from the end result back to, well, how did we figure out that we could do that? What information do we need? So we find the reserved organ for a specific request. We send it to the hospital. How do we know where the hospital is? Well, I'm going to put the hospital object here. And the hospital object has the contact information, has the location, and all of those things. Okay? So I can then send it to the hospital. But you remember that we have a best before date on all the organs, if I can put it that way. There was a 48-hour requirement from the time we get the organ from a supplier to the time we test it, time we match it up against a request and ship it out to a hospital. Well, it has to arrive before the organ expires. And we've said in this particular case for this project, we've said that that's 48 hours. Well, how do we know that we can get this organ to the hospital on time before those 48 hours? So we know how old the organ is. How do we know that? And again, the question that we ask tells us about the data that we need. We know because we have a date and time received from the supplier here. So that tells us when it arrived. And it's 48 hours from is it 48 hours from the time it arrived, or was it 48 hours from the time that it was harvested? Well, the answer is not the time we received, although we're certainly going to keep track, but the date and time harvested originally. Okay, so we need that information to tell us how old is it now. Well, if we know how old is it now, how can we figure out how old it'll be by the time it gets to the hospital? The hospital could be an hour away, 20 minutes away. It could be 4 hours away if we have to fly it somewhere across the country. So how do we know? Well, let's here, as part of the hospital object, attribute another piece of data, and that is travel time. I'm going to call it travel time to the hospital from TORDIS Central, okay, from us, in other words, right? So if we have the date and time that it was harvested, the organ, that tells us how old it is now, and we have the travel time. So if the travel time is more than the 48 hours, then we're not going to ship it to the hospital. If it is less than 48 hours, we can ship it to the hospital. So the question then becomes, so we can then ship it to the hospital, or we don't ship it to the hospital because we didn't find a match that could get to the hospital in time. Do we want to remember that we've shipped it to the hospital? Yes, we do, of course, right? So we're going to keep track of the organ, and I'm going to put here, shipped and the data attribute to support that would be the date and time shipped to the hospital. And of course, we want to keep track of when they received it. So we want to be able to get a data flow here confirming it in terms of the fact that it was received. And I want to remember that it was received here as well. So not only shipped, but also the date and time received. And here, I'm going to have date and time received. This original one was from the supplier, of course, right? So I'm going to put supplier here, and I'm going to have the date and time received by the hospital here, so I'll keep track of that. So the three questions we always ask are always here. You know, how do I know that it's time to ship an organ to a hospital, followed by what am I going to do about that, followed by what am I going to remember or record about what I've done. So I have that captured here now. And finally, I have to write a narrative. Well, the narrative might read something like this. Find an organ that's been reserved against a request for a hospital and ship that organ to the hospital. Remember that's been shipped. When we get information about the hospital receiving that organ, remember that it's been received by the hospital. Keep track of that. There's your narrative. Write that up. Now, I have to name this, of course. I'm going to name it with a strong verb-noun construct. I'm just going to call it ship organ. Now, we always apply the 80-20 rule when we do this. Okay? My version of the 80-20 rule, or Pareto's law, is don't sweat the little stuff. You know, there's someone else who's going to look at this in terms of either selecting software or designing and constructing software. Let them do some thinking about it as well. They're going to have to tear it apart and get right down to the nitty-gritty bits and bytes of this. We need to be able to specify the requirement in such a way that they can do that. And we now have the picture, we have narrative, we have some new data attributes. The only thing we have to do now is do the business rules table for this.